The Answers, episode 23. I'm joined today with my amazing co host, and I'll go ahead and let him introduce himself.
Hello, I'm Anavultus. Thank you for tuning in today, our beautiful audience.
Yes, thank you. This is going to be I call it a special episode, kind of, because this is the first that we've done something like this. Usually we're talking about a current event or some sort of philosophical topic that's, been discussed before. This time we've kind of decided, well, you decided really to come up with I guess you could call it abstract topic idea where we would make our own political platforms and have, potential candidates, run off of it and things like that. So, what made you kind of think of this idea before we kind of get into what our platform is?
Yeah. Well, I had actually suggested this idea to Stephen Ignoramus on Twitter, but he hasn't responded in over a week. And that's because he had told me that he was perhaps interested in running for Congress. I was thinking of running for Congress, although still up in the air whether that'll happen or not. But I thought, nevertheless, that it's a useful exercise to have to both understand what exactly it is that a candidate would be running for as an individual candidate, and also critique each other on particular policy positions and on the effectiveness that we might imagine our particular style of writing might have in regards to whether it would gain voters or not.
Right. I think it's fairly easy to say that political parties do have, like, their political party platform does have meaning. Because it wasn't too long ago where the Republican Party decided to not have a party platform and basically say we're doing what Trump's gonna do, and many people in the news and elsewhere were like, whoa, this is bad for Republicans. This looks bad. You need to have a party platform. So I think that there are people that very much value what is in a party platform, as they probably should.
Yeah. And I think it's also worth noting that both of the major parties in the United States are big tent parties, which means that they include a wide variety of voters and therefore also a wide variety of candidates in their positions. So it's always important for candidates to put forward what their own particular positions are when they're running for office, because they, as individuals, will be responsible in the exercise of their duties in whatever office they receive.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that definitely makes sense for sure. And I think one other thing, just before we get into the details, it's also something to think about that. I need to turn it off. The idea that let me see. Let me restart. So when you have political parties and you have candidates like you were just saying, it's also a recent meeting that candidates are going to have something that maybe doesn't completely align with the political party. In other words, somebody may not be as strict on, let's just say, drugs compared to what their political party platform wants them to be. Or
Yeah.
So that's also another thing that I thought needed to be mentioned in general before we get into like the role that it has to play. So I don't know if you wanted to say anything else before we get into the political party platforms themselves, but if you did want to bring something else up or have a question, definitely go ahead.
Yes, I will as and when opportunities emerge.
Okay, for sure. In that case, I guess we could start with your political party. Let me switch tabs over, and then we can go to mine. And
Platform.
platform, sorry, yes,
Yeah.
political platform. And I thought we would first start with like I
Yeah.
call
This
it
this
the
isn't a party manifesto.
no. That's a yeah, that definitely needs to make made clear. But I thought we would first start with like the
Yeah.
beginning.
This we're not designing political parties. We're just Yeah,
Right.
yeah, the beginning. Yeah. So I went for a look at so the first element here is preserving Lincoln's legacy. And I think something that's important to emphasize here is which particular party would be receiving this platform. Which party are you expecting to get voters from? So, by putting preserving Lincoln's legacy, Abraham Lincoln has a lot of bipartisan popularity in the United States, but he is particularly known as the first Republican president of the United States. So, because of that, preserving Lincoln's legacy should make it obvious that this is an appeal to the Republican Party while also being a more broader American appeal as well. So, the
Hmm.
first point to keep America united, emphasizing one of the achievements of Lincoln, the preservation of the Union, it is essential to use law enforcement and whatever additional force is suitable to overcome insurrectionists and rebels so that law, order, and due process may triumph over anarchy, chaos, and destruction in our country. And that's pretty straightforward. So this would mean getting rid of potential rebellions or even secessionist movements to some extent. Uh, but it also has an emphasis on the idea of due process. And I made sure that I mentioned that so that people would not be able to get away with accusing me of attempting to be tyrannical in the position. The second point on here is to end the enslavement of Americans, native and immigrant, referencing another one of Lincoln's achievements. Native and immigrant meaning Americans who are born as citizens and Americans who are not born as citizens but who become Americans. It is necessary to keep a careful watch of the border and dedicated law enforcement so that human trafficking, sweatshops, and illicit drug trade are eliminated. So, of course, human trafficking, a major issue on the U.S. border. Sweatshops, especially for people that immigrate illegally, can be a problem. Even legally speaking, there's always a problem of sweatshops, of abuse of workers, and things like that. I think that's a very tenable position. And illicit drug trade, specifically, of course, referring to people trading drugs illegally. If it's licit, then obviously this isn't what it's referring to.
Right. Yeah. All that definitely makes sense. Like, there's nothing really to necessarily argue on that front. But I also like the idea that you did use Lincoln, because even before you said what you said at the start, I thought that people would be willing to potentially switch, depending on their political opinions necessarily. So I thought using Lincoln was smart there. Uh,
Yeah. And I think an important thing to note is that platforms aren't only meant to express particular policy positions, they're also meant as rhetorical tools to make appeals both from well, not both, but three types of appeals largely: emotional appeals, moral appeals, as well as more logical appeals. You have the pathos, logos, ethos together here as a rhetorical strategy. And so emphasizing Abraham Lincoln and his legacy in ending slavery and preserving the Union is therefore not only a position that favors a particular policy, and it is a position that favors a particular policy, but also is a position that brings together historical elements of the country, an understanding of the past, and therefore allows more people to engage with the position rather than if I simply said we need to protect the border, enforce laws, and make sure that there aren't rebellions, because that's a very plain and sanitized way of saying it. But by expanding it rhetorically, I'm not changing the position. I'm opening the position and allowing more people to engage with the position. And I think that that's something that's very important to do when you're making a platform for a candidate, because a platform for a candidate is also a tool for publicity and for campaigning and for getting people to be on your side when they're going to vote for you.
Right, definitely. And not to say anything against what you have, because I don't mean it in that way, but you also want to make it somewhat vague when doing something like this as well, to give the ability of the person to make it their own, belief or their own point on what they want to do. That's the way I take it as well. Take it,
Well,
but yeah,
I wouldn't say vague. I would say flexible.
flexible. That's a
Okay.
good word for it.
And and when I'm saying flexible, I'm not covering up the idea of the word vague. Let me be very clear on that. I'm not implicitly saying that people should be vague. What I'm saying is that politicians work as a team, especially if we're talking about congressmen, because this is for members of the House of Representatives, for example. So when a congressman gets elected to Congress, he doesn't become a dictator who decides how the country runs. He has to work as a team with the other representatives, with the senators, with the president, the cabinet, the departments, the agencies, the courts. It's all one larger uh, entity, and they're all working as a team. Now, they might not all be working together and towards the same goal, but it's still important to understand that in our system that has checks and balances, to get something done, you need to be able to be somewhat flexible in your position. You also need to have the humility to understand that your exact solution to a problem may not exactly be the best solution that there ever is. And so there are places where I'm willing to say that I actually don't know everything there is to know about a subject, and where I would rely on cooperation with others to solve a problem. So I think that's very important to emphasize.
Yes, I definitely agree with that as well. And I thought I would kind of switch back and forth for at least a little bit. So I'll move over to what I had at the beginning. And I kind of wanted to start with a mission statement, I guess you could say. And basically, I just put the focus of government shouldn't be to rule, but rather serve your needs. The way government works now does not do that. For example, the way government works now is by acting as your boss and telling you what to do, when it should be you tell the government what to do. Therefore, Therefore, the perception of how government is viewed needs to be changed. And I ended it with a quote from Benjamin Rush. As he says, it is favorable to liberty. Freedom can exist only in a society of knowledge. Without learning, men are incapable of knowing their rights, and when learning is confirmed to a few people, liberty can neither be equal nor universal. So that is how I kind of started mine, because I wanted to get people focused on kind of how I would view it necessarily. Not that this is like my own political platform by any means, but I just wanted to make sure I set early on kind of how I view different policies going on.
Yeah, and I think it's important to emphasize that these platforms aren't our idealized positions. They
Mm-hmm.
are more practical positions for change in the context of our current status as a country and society.
Right.
I think it's interesting seeing that your focus is liberty and also on uh, on democracy in some ways. Uh, so that evinces a particular type of political philosophy that I think is particular to some of the founding fathers, like Thomas Jefferson, Thomas Paine, for example. Whereas I'm a bit more on the Alexander Hamilton, John Adams side of things when looking at things. Uh, but I think is Benjamin Rush commonly abbreviated Ben Rush?
Maybe not. I did that because I didn't want to spell his last name wrong when I was typing it, so I just put Ben Rush. I have heard people refer to him as Ben Rush before, but I don't know if that's a common thing or not.
Yeah, because if you're going to make a quote, um, making the person who's making the quote recognizable can lend credibility to your quote. So, for example, who is Benjamin Rush? Just for our audience.
Yeah, Benjamin Rush was a founding father of the country, and he was also he's not one of the more like extremely well known ones, but he was involved in the government of the founding fathers. I believe he was a doctor, if I'm not mistaken, and I know for sure that he was one of the founding fathers that was against slavery and pretty adamant that it needed to be not happen. So that's just a very quick
Yeah,
history of Benjamin
but do,
Rush.
but do you think a common knowledge would understand who this Ben Rush is? Someone with common knowledge who maybe only half paid attention in history class and who otherwise doesn't really have much interaction with founding documents or any of that. Do you think that person would know who Benjamin Rush is?
I would say probably not.
Yet. So what you should do is
Mm-hmm.
add an extra bit after Benjamin Rush, comma, and then uh, founding father, or if he held a particular office, you can put that. Um, because then that makes it clear to people who aren't exactly familiar with Benjamin Rush who that is. Because otherwise, it's a bit vague, and people are wondering who is this Ben Rush, and why should I care what Ben Rush says?
No, I definitely see what you're saying for sure. Yeah, yeah, because he definitely doesn't have the name recognition of Lincoln as you used, or maybe even like Benjamin Franklin. It was another one that quotes that I was thinking about using. He definitely doesn't have the right I can't speak name recognition as those people do. So I definitely see what you're saying for sure.
Yeah.
I thought we could move to your first thing on the economy, and then
Okay. The
oops,
economy. And
there
I
it goes.
think the order in which these things are placed is important. For example, I put the economy immediately after Lincoln, and the reason for that is because a lot of people care about the economy, especially today with a recession from coronavirus and potentially other things as well. Uh, People have a saying, "The economy, stupid," and they're talking about politicians, and politicians put policies towards various things, and if they don't address the economy, then it's not likely to be popular because everybody is affected by the economy in some way. So if people are seeing a bad economy, that's putting a squeeze on their wallets, and they're going to look at the government and wonder what is the government doing or what isn't the government doing. And therefore, the economy is always a very important issue, especially when you consider that money is power very frequently. Um, so that's why I put the economy immediately here, because I thought that it would be a very important issue to a lot of people. So somebody who doesn't have a long attention span could look into the economy. And I think it's important also to see that I use different font sizes to make certain things pop. So I begin each element on the list with a brief phrase describing a goal or whatever something relates to when I'm talking about something. So, to restore the reliability of the United States dollar, the money supply must be limited to only increase at the same rate as the population growth of our country, so that the savings of Americans are not cruelly devalued. The government may not spend wastefully, and investors will have the security of knowing that the dollar will not fail them. So I end also with three additional reasons for this idea. So fundamentally, this is something that, and you know, I'm politically, ideologically a Coinonist. This is something that I've pulled out of Coinonism, the idea of monetarism and Coinonism, and I've essentially applied monetarism here as well. So what this means is that there's a fixed rate of money in the money supply that is equivalent or proportional to the population. So you're only allowed to print more money as the population increases. And if the population increases, then you're not allowed to print more money, obviously. And I think that this is an important element here. If you want to talk more about it, we can. But anyway, I'll move on. To provide a more adaptable method for federal revenue, federal income, and corporate taxes among the residents of the several states should be replaced with a direct tax on each state in proportion to its population, in accordance with the words of our Constitution, so that so that different states may tax in a manner that agrees with their own economic strengths and competes for efficiency and prosperity. This is based on something that's actually in the Constitution. The US government is allowed to tax in this particular way, and it's in fact recommended in the Constitution before the amendment allowing for individual income tax. And so what this means is that the government calculates their budget, and you can't do this if you don't have a budget. Uh, and then assigns the cost to the various states, who then can raise those taxes in whichever way they want, and the cost is assigned based on the population of the states. Now, of course, the District of Columbia and territories and places that aren't states would not be affected by this, as I wrote it anyway. But I think an important element of terminology here is the several states. I think I used this a few more times in this document, compared to these United States and the United States. So the United States is referring to the country as a single entity. These United States, as a phrase, is referring to the country as being both a single entity but with a plural element. And the several states, sorry, is referring to simply the states collectively, but outside of the context of the union, which isn't to say it's negating the union, but it's saying things happening on the state level in multiple states. That's essentially what it's saying.
Right. So
At third point, to ensure that, yeah,
no, I was just gonna say real
you have a
quick
question?
before you. Well, yeah, kind of a question. I think you kind of said it already. Just want to make it clear in my mind. So when you're talking about these points here, you're wanting more of a state by state, trying to get better economy and maybe get rid of the debt, blah blah blah. Or are you talking more of a wide scale thing here?
Well, what I'm talking about is the way taxes should be levied, specifically on this point. And what I'm saying is, rather than centralizing taxation so that the federal government decides exactly which way taxes are raised, the federal government instead makes a budget and then assigns the cost of the budget to the several states, um, based on how many people are in those states. And then the states get to decide how exactly they want to tax the people in the state. And therefore, if a state has certain economic strengths, then that allows them to gear their taxation in a way that emphasizes their strengths.
Okay. Yeah, that makes more sense then. Yeah.
It also funnels control of federal revenue through the states, which gives the states a bit more power in that respect because they're essentially handling a lot of the money that goes to the federal government.
Right. And a lot of states do have budgets. Now, do they follow their budgets is another story, but I could see a system where having to make a state pick its own taxation, and you can tell me if I'm wrong talking about this, and then them picking their strong suits, as you just mentioned, and getting more money from it, and then giving that money then to the federal government and their needs and budgets. I could see that potentially working if the states, decide to make a budget a major concern and do anything they can to not exceed the budget. So I think that issue would have
Yeah,
to be
and
addressed, but
yeah, but at that point, that issue is an issue for the state and
right,
no
right.
longer becomes the federal government's specific problem.
Right, right. It would only become a problem if the federal government never gets money from them, let's say. And then I could see that being a potential, but I don't
Yeah,
think that would work either. But yeah, I see what you're saying.
yeah. Did you want me to go to the next couple points?
Yeah, let's go to the next couple
And anyway,
points and then.
I'll go. Yeah, to ensure that a free and competitive market is maintained, the federal government should not bail out businesses whose business models have shown themselves to be inadequate in hardship, or businesses whose business models have shown themselves to be sufficiently strong to overcome hardship. If the people deem it necessary that a bailout should occur, let it happen within the states so that those solving the problems are not estranged from the problems by distance. This essentially says that rather than doing federal bailouts, the states should decide whether they need bailouts and how much to bail out. Uh, and four, to establish a balanced approach to economic regulations and subsidies, the federal government should not involve itself with any industry which is not directly linked to the functions of the federal government, like defense contractors. Instead, all such industries may benefit through regulation, deregulation, and subsidies from the several states. Furthermore, the federal government should establish a forum wherein the states may choose to voluntarily cooperate with each other on economic policy directly, distinct from congressional regulation. So, what this is saying is something similar to the last point, where instead of the federal government doing things, the states are now doing these things. And because of the interstate commerce clause, any cooperation between the states would have to happen on the federal level. And therefore, I provide for a forum for states to cooperate if they want to on a particular economic issue.
Right. Uh, that I mean that makes a lot of sense because the only example I kind of had thinking about this from a potential approach, especially when you mentioned like defense contractors, right, is if there would be a hypothetical World War III. But then I'm like, well, then the federal government's going to get involved. So this economic system you have would probably be adapted to fit the needs of war. We've seen that in the past. So I don't really think that goes kind of against your
Yeah,
fourth
well,
point there. So, no, go on.
yeah, well, that's why I mentioned defense contractors specifically to explain that there are areas where the federal government may need to intervene in certain situations, such as in a time of war, we need to make sure that we have a reliable supply of munitions, and therefore the federal government should be allowed to pay a lot of money to munitions factories in times of war. I think that makes sense.
Right. I do have one counterclaim, and this may not be true, but we are in a couple of wars now. And Biden said that he's going to pull troops from one in 9/11, which is, anyway, we don't have to get into that. But we still over in foreign lands with troops. So I guess my question here is, how are you going to necessarily regulate that? Because there could be a way for the government to say, oh, we're in war. We need to make sure we still produce, these tanks or these vehicles. And yeah.
Well, what's important to understand about wars is that throughout most of history, there's something called a small war. And small war doesn't mean it's a lesser war in scale. What it means is that it's not a full-blown war of conquest, not an active military campaign, but instead is little skirmishes here and there and things happening. And for a lot of countries in history, this is a normal status to be in. So in that sense, especially if it's a powerful country that's interacting with a lot of countries, this is actually pretty normal. So when people are concerned about their various things, we could say that obviously, even in times of peace, the U.S. government will be engaging in anti-piracy operations and things like that. So I'm not going to specifically argue exactly where exactly all of our troops should be and whether every exact conflict that the U.S. is involved in is legitimate, because I think that's far beyond the scope of what we're talking about.
Right.
But I do think that even in times of peace, it's important for a military to be well equipped and well trained, because they may eventually need to be at war. So in that sense, the military industrial complex is something that we can't really get rid of if we want to be a defensible country. However, we can reorganize the laws in the government to make sure that the influence that wealthy people in the defense contracting industry have is greatly reduced.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, from this platform, you're not necessarily addressing that issue. I just thought I would bring that up to kind of get your, I guess you could say, extended belief or opinion on how your point would address that. So I think that does make a lot of sense for sure. And in general, I would say I support that opinion, but that's a separate topic, really. I'm going to move over to what I had for economy, just so we go back and forth a little bit. Whoop. There it goes. Okay. So I'll first talk about how I had mine ordered. The way I ordered mine is by the thing I'm most passionate about, and the thing I think that people in general should be passionate about to try to make a better system. Now, the reason I have economy, I think it's like third or fourth. One, two, third. Yeah, it's third. Was because I'll admit that I particularly should know a lot more about economy. Maybe it's just because of my age or anything, but I really don't know a whole bunch about economy. But from the research I did in preparation for this, I came up with these points. So I would start with my first one here. Need to stop printing money without a need or cause. This would include stopping emergency relief bills and mass spending on the military. That is my first point, and I'll talk briefly about it. Basically, my idea here being is that right now the government is simply printing money to fit things that need to happen. So maybe that's transportation and roads, maybe it's military, maybe it's healthcare needs like Medicare and that stuff. We're just simply printing money to try to reach the budgets that people in cabinet positions and government and whatnot have to use it. I'm basically saying we need to put a stop to it and come up with budgets to make sure that we can actually manage the money we're printing. Because right now, people could say that, yes, we are managing the money we're printing, but I don't really think that they're looking as long term as they need to be looking, especially with the relief bills that are happening now. And that's why I threw that in there now, because I don't necessarily think that more relief bills need to be passed. My second point
Yeah.
is, do you have anything to say about that? Or
Well, I would say that whenever people talk about reducing spending on the military, obviously people will be able to agree on the idea of streamlining military spending to remove things that are obviously wasteful. But beyond that, we have to then get into the question of what exactly you want to cut. So this is something where if you're cutting spending on something specific, we need to know exactly how we're going to be cutting the spending. And that's, I think, a problem that a lot of people that talk about cutting military spending um, don't really get into the actual plan on what the numbers are and where exactly the cuts should happen. And I think that that's something that's very important.
yeah, that definitely is a good point. Because when in research for the point, there was a lot of people in videos and whatnot that are basically saying that we have agreements with these countries. So if you were to simply say you're going to cut military spending, you could be saying that you're going to cut the agreed amount you said you were going to spend or give that country, excuse me, for their military in this case. But I think that is something, and I do talk a little bit about that in my foreign policy section. But that is something that it's not necessarily as easy as it sounds. So I'm glad you did bring that up. And just to answer your question a little bit, I think the only way to necessarily do that is to rearrange agreements you've had with the countries. So I think that that's the only way you're ultimately going to end up spending less,
Yeah,
and that's going to take a long
but that's
time.
more in the foreign policy.
Yeah, right.
Yeah,
My second point is the government scale needs to be greatly reduced as well as scaled back. This would include balancing all budgets and reducing spending and debt for all government departments. So that kind of expanded what I kind of had in my first point, but I kind of explained that, where basically I'm saying that we need to put a stop to it and figure out new budgets for even our own departments that we have now, transportation, healthcare, all of these things, and come up with budgets to actually break even or at least not lose as much, because right now we're losing quite a bit. Third point, in order to balance the budget, a freeze will be made for bond insurance and all other ways the government can borrow spending from. So the reason I put that in there is the only way I thought this would work is if you cut the government's power to not make it happen. So the only way I think that this would work is say you have to fit it in the budget, and there's literally no other way you can borrow money from banks to try to avoid the budget necessarily. So no more borrowing from banks, and yeah, I think that that's makes sense to me at least. The fourth point I have, this would not include a freeze on private citizens or businesses within the concern of money being justified. The free market will take care of the needs of the individual. So that was my last point. Basically, I'm saying that the banks can still give out loans to people and to businesses, but I don't want banks to give loans to government until we figure out a budget solution to fix the problem. Even if we can't necessarily address the debt we already have, but at least break even from now on is kind of the approach I'm taking.
yeah, yeah.
So it may
Yeah,
be,
I think that that's an interesting approach. You tackled the idea of reducing debt, which is something that I actually didn't look into very much. Um, however, I do think it is something that's important, although I think one thing that's important to understand about the nature of the debt that the U.S. government has is that it's not debt that's insolvent in the sense that the government isn't actually behind on its payments of any of the debt that it has incurred. And because it's not behind on any of the payments, the debt actually doesn't have any direct negative impacts on the economy, besides, of course, speculation. Uh, that's not saying that I'm in favor of debt. Let me be very clear. I don't want the government to be in debt. I just think that the debt is an issue that is dealt with from my perspective after certain other issues are dealt with, and I focus more on those issues, such as the exact way in which taxes should be taken, uh, and how the budget should be done, how the state and the federal government interact economically, and therefore clearing out clutter and immediate issues to then deal with another deeper issue behind it. So that's a way in which my platform uh, focuses on certain issues that I consider more immediate over other issues.
Right, definitely. Uh, that is a potential weakness I do see with my platform and with the research I was doing. And I did decide to pick debt as kind of the first thing. And my logic behind that was I wanted the government to fix their own problem before they start fixing, individual states and whatnot. So I kind of wanted to say if we can fix this debt problem or at least get a solution to fix the debt problem, I feel like we would be better off economy wise to then do things like you have or similar things like it to fix that. So I kind of took the opposite approach for that, thinking that the debt needed to be addressed first. But
Yeah, because if we don't change our spending habits and the way in which we manage money, and then we simply tackle the debt as a problem in itself, I think that's treating a symptom but not the disease that is causing the symptom.
right, that's a good way of putting it. I think. Yeah. I'm trying to think of a counter argument to it. The only thing I really think of is kind of just what I've already said. The idea being that I think the government needs to solve their own issues, but obviously just fixing debt isn't necessarily going to fix that problem completely. So I do definitely see what you're saying there. So I thought we would
Yeah.
bounce back to yours here.
Okay. The rights of Americans. This is a segment that I title it in a way that is somewhat eye catching, in a way that leads people to look into it, uh, in a way that also emphasizes the Americanness once again. I think patriotism in a political platform is always useful to have, and it's always useful to express as well. Number one, to protect the lives of Americans of all ages and end the systematic murder of the unborn that has claimed over 60 million victims, a constitutional amendment must be made that explicitly affirms the rights of all Americans from conception till death, so that no American is, with the complicity of the law, denied his rights on account of age, health, ancestry, sex, religion, or anything that might be used to prejudicially divide Americans. Once again, I think it's important to, by the way, this over 60 million number, that's an accurate number. I want to emphasize, first of all. And as a Christian, it's something that's a very near and dear to me, the issue of abortion. And therefore, that's one of those things that I'm actually not willing to compromise on. Um, in fact, if you had to ask me any of these points, if I could have any of them, this is the one. So, in that sense, There you go. And I frame it in a way that isn't only looking at the unborn, but looks at all people in the country at the same time. And I think that's a very positive way to frame it, a way that emphasizes certain values that the U.S. government holds and that a lot of Americans hold as well. Number two, to protect the honest conviction of a people and open political discourse, it is necessary to be vigilant against potential infringements of the First Amendment to our Constitution that may lead to a censorious or repressive government that mandates or prohibits various views. Essentially affirming the First Amendment. I'm not going to establish a consistory like Geneva. I'm not going to do a theocracy or theonomy or anything like that. To ensure that our country remains defensible, Congress must fulfill its duty to protect and uphold the Second Amendment rights to keep and bear arms. So this takes the right to keep and bear arms, and it also frames it in the same way that the Constitution frames it. That is in a more general sense of defending the country. Number four, to protect the legal integrity of the United States, law enforcement agencies must vigorously uphold the law and prosecute those who break it relentlessly while remaining fully accountable themselves for any corruption or malfeasance, and ensuring that every citizen is not denied his rights to due process as they are written in the Constitution and other statutes. So essentially, I want law and order, but I also want to make sure that the police is accountable if there is any abuse. To protect the will of the people in elections, it is necessary to ensure that every voter is identifiable and accountable, that no one is unlawfully deprived of his right to vote, that the election process is transparent and has safeguards against corruption, that suspicions of malfeasance be met with a legal recourse that examines the evidence given, and that Electoral College is maintained in accordance with its design and intent given by the Founding Fathers. So this goes back to a number of different events. Of course, we had already talked in a previous episode about the Federalist and Anti-Federalist position on the Electoral College. I'm siding with the Federalist position here. I'm talking about the importance of a transparent election process. I'm talking about that we need to ensure that voters are identifiable. And I'm also saying that if, hypothetically speaking, there were accusations made, hypothetically, of course, that something went wrong in a particular election, that we should be able to examine that, legally speaking, and make a decision based on the evidence.
Right. Obviously, with all of these, you would have questions about how you would ensure that it would happen, but I don't necessarily think that that is kind of what this section is for necessarily. It's more just bullet points of issues, I would say. And issues may be the wrong word, but I guess I'll start from the top.
Yeah, well, I did talk about law enforcement.
Yes, you did, yeah. So,
yeah,
I'm in agreement with the first point in pretty much 100% as well. I was just kind of laughing, and you talked a little bit about it, but I was like, where's your source, Because I could see someone on the comment section, if someone watches the video afterwards and whatnot, saying like, where's your source? But anyway, I could believe that number for sure. But, and this isn't...
It is. I think there's even people proofreading these things. This isn't actually a current source. This is a source from a few years ago, so it's probably higher than that. So this is actually a conservative estimate.
Right. Now, this isn't part of the section. This is more just me being curious, and I don't remember you talking about this in another point. If you did, we can skip this question. But how would you ultimately do this? How would you end abortion? Just to say a question like that.
Well, as I said, we would put a constitutional amendment, and as many constitutional amendments say, Congress can make laws to enforce them, and therefore it would go into the U.S. Code, the criminal law section of it,
Hmm.
that we have looked at before in some episodes, and therefore people who are committing abortions, including the actual person who is receiving, who is, let's say, the mother of the child. If a mother of the child consents to an abortion, or commits an abortion, that is also considered punishable. And this was a controversial position when Trump expressed it in an interview when he was running in 2016. But I don't think that this is something that I'm actually going to walk back. I don't think it's something worth walking back. I think it's something that's worth taking in. That I consider, okay, the mother of a child to be uh, complicit in the murder of a child in the case of an abortion.
Okay, just
So it would be treated legally as a murder.
yes, yep. Okay, one thing. What would you say to the people that would potentially have the questions of, well, what happens if the mother could die from the birth, or the other claim you hear a lot from pro-choice? What about rape? What would you say about those two clauses to
Yeah.
arguments in this?
So 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 in the case of what if somebody could die, then I think under medical ethics, if there's two people that are both severely injured or at risk of dying, and you can only save one, and in saving one, the other one would inevitably die, that is not considered a murder under the U.S. law. And so, if we consider abortion as following in the same pattern as laws in regards to murder and manslaughter, then that would be a situation where, uh, through triage, uh, it wouldn't be that we simply automatically commit an abortion, but it would be up to the people involved to make a decision to save a life, and that is it's a difficult decision, but as far as I understand, it's entirely legal. In similar situations that do not involve abortion, such things happen, and therefore, if we extend the law as it applies to those situations to abortion, we can say a similar thing. Is what I'm saying.
Yeah, no, I
Now, in the
understand that.
case of rape and incest, I would say, once again, I make an emphasis on the rights of the child, and therefore there's a right to due process. And so, triage being considered uh, roughly a due process. I don't know what the exact legal doctrine on that is, but I understand it is something that's respected. But in the case of rape, the child cannot be held guilty for the crime of the parent in U.S. law. And therefore, that is not a case wherein abortion would be permissible. Now, I understand that there might be some libertarians. I'm not saying all. I'm being very specific about a particular group of libertarians who might say that it's trespassing if a pregnancy occurs. That can be considered trespassing. Um, I I think that in the context of protecting children from neglect and murder by their own parents, that would similarly apply to the unborn. So I would not extend the idea of you're trespassing to an infant in somebody's body, and likewise, I would not expand that to a child living in the home of a parent.
Right. The only concern I would have for this, because like I said, I am in agreement with what you're saying here, is the Supreme Court. That's the only way I could see something getting involved that could overturn this, because they could say that it's
Well,
unlawful.
that's why
But
I said it's a constitutional amendment.
right, and that's why I saw that. So I
Because
mean,
if it's a constitutional amendment, the Supreme Court can't do anything about that.
right, right,
They don't get to decide if a constitutional amendment is constitutional. They don't have a judicial review over constitutional amendments.
right. So that's where you kind of get that covered. So yeah, I definitely agree with
Yeah.
what your answers were also to my questions there, but I'm not too hard to convince when it comes to abortion. So
Yeah, but basically, I'm extending legal doctrines that apply to other situations to also apply in the case of abortion.
hmm and for your second point here, the only question I had and to it is essentially how do I say this? Let's put it this way. So, for your second question, for your second point, I should say, how would you address hateful speech, or would you just say that's free speech?
I would say people are freely allowed to hate other people so long as they do not violate the rights of other people by damaging their property, committing libel, or engaging in various other criminal acts. So I consider hatred toward particular positions to be something that, while I'm not a very hateful person, I don't go around hating various people, especially strangers. I think it's, to me, extremely difficult to hate a stranger. Um, I understand the idea that, politically speaking, if you restrict certain types of speeches, it might also restrict your ability to have certain types of political discussions.
Mm-hmm.
And therefore that is a problem. Now, if it is something that actively causes a disruption, for example, uh, someone spreading viciously false rumors about someone else, uh, then under existing laws, that's actually that can be prosecuted. But if somebody is saying something true about somebody else and then simply says, I don't like it, and therefore I hate this person for that reason, I think that that is constitutionally allowable. Um, and I think it's also important because I want to live in an honest society. I want people to be honest with me if they don't like me. I don't want to live in a society where people are secretly opposing me rather than openly opposing me. And I think that this is a problem with a lot of hate speech legislation, is that those people that are being legislated against, they don't go away. They're just oppressed in some way, and therefore, to them, they are feeling more legitimized because they're being oppressed for their seriously held convictions. And that actually makes it more difficult to de radicalize people from certain positions because they're hidden and you can't have an open discussion.
Right. That's how I thought you were going to answer that, and To me, that makes total sense, and because the only way that I could say someone going against it is saying that, well, you need to be very careful, but I don't really believe in that's the correct way of doing things. So I don't really have a counter to that necessarily, because I do think that even hate speech to some extent is good because it allows for discourse. Now it depends on what is being said, obviously, and death threats are not part of that. I want to make that clear. But yeah, I mean, that just makes sense. Okay, we talk about the Congress to fulfill duty, Second Amendment. So you have the Second Amendment. Uh, would this be with all guns? Now that we're having to debate over like the AK-47 and all that, would that point be with all guns, or would that be up to the Congress? Like, how would you adjust that third point?
Well, my position is that ultimately, I think it should be. I think that the common person should not be able to own weapons of mass destruction. That is to say, nuclear bombs, uh, chemical weapons, bioweapons, radiological weapons, weapons that essentially are difficult to limit the effects of. I think that that's something that should be the exclusive domain of the military. But in the context of arms, I think a lot of it has to do with your local law. Because if you have very high quality law enforcement, uh, then I can see the idea that it's not really necessary in certain cases. But obviously, in many cases, let's say you're in the middle of Montana, you're not going to be able to wait for the police to arrive. So it obviously makes a lot of sense to have guns in that area. So what I think should happen is that the exact form that militias can take, as described in the U.S. Constitution, can influence how arms might be distributed and how people can bear arms. But what I think it ultimately should be up to is the local community, the locale, the town people live in. Where if the mayor is looking at the town and there's people shredding up public roads with tank treads, that's obviously a problem. Now, if they're private roads and they're shredding them up with tank treads and they own those roads or have permission to use them, then that's fine. But I think it's important to understand that we live in a society. We can't all have full automatic machine guns everywhere. Now, that being said, I am in favor of people being able to own any type of small arm. I think even some explosives would be fine. I think if you want a military vehicle with a gun on it, I think that's fine. If you're on the sea and you want a gunboat of some kind, I think that's fine. Uh, but I think that if you have a gun, then you should make your local community aware of it so that they can call you in as militia, that you are an armed person. And I think it's important for the case of a militia that they are able to call upon the people in their community that are armed and capable for combat.
Right.
I'm not saying that the guns themselves should be registered. Let me be very clear on that. What I'm saying is that they should know that you are an armed person and that therefore, in the case of a militia or a posse comitatus or something like that, that they would be able to call upon an armed person for help.
Right. Yeah. Uh, Only thing I could say to that is some people could say that that would be a slippery slope to the next step of saying that you have to register, but that's not ultimately what you're saying, and that's kind of
Yeah. I'm saying that it's just in the context of a community.
right, right,
I'm
and
not saying that we should have a national registry or even a state registry.
mhm. Yeah, I've always struggled with the Second Amendment in the factor of a lot of people are like, well, it's our God given right to have these guns and AK-47s and whatnot, and I'm like, I mean, I'm all support of people having guns. I have, well, my dad has guns. I don't have a gun personally, but we have guns in the house, and I've grown up around guns and shot them many times before, and blah 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 blah. But I've always struggled with the factor of do you really need to have the AK-47 necessarily? I don't necessarily think that you really have to, but at the same time, I'm in support of someone having a gun. I'm not saying that you don't. It's one or the other. You can still have a gun, but that's kind of the way I view the Second Amendment. But I always struggle with
Yeah,
that because no, go on.
and I think that people that are former felons, people that have fully served their time, should be allowed to rearm themselves. Um, and I think that's a more controversial position, but I think that, of course, depends on whether the community that they live in considers them a danger. Uh, so, what I'm saying is, within a community, these issues can take a more easily digestible dynamic. Where on a national level, there's so many different things happening that we can't exactly look at every possible situation and every possible reason someone might be armed and every possible understanding of uh, how people are armed or not or unarmed. But if we just take it to the community level, we enter into a situation where we can actually talk about the issue personally and come to an understanding of what exactly we want and what exactly we need in our community, and that and exactly in which way we are able to protect the rights of people to keep and bear arms. Because so therefore I think a community solution is here. For example, we don't allow people who are in prison to keep and bear arms. Uh, I think that's something that's important to note. Uh, that there are exceptions to the rules, and those exceptions are judicial rather than prejudicial. So I would say if there is an exception to the rule, it should be judicial rather than prejudicial.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm all for community-based solutions rather than federal-based solutions. I think that they generally lead to better results. So I think we both share that opinion with several discussions we've had on various topics.
Yeah, because if I'm going to if I go to, let's say, someplace in Oregon, and let's say they have a helicopter carrier with attack helicopters. Uh, I don't know whether that's something that's useful. I don't know whether that's something that that person is responsible over uh, a responsible user or not, and therefore I'm not going to go into that town from a Washingtonian perspective, not in the perspective of the state of Washington or of George Washington, but the perspective of Washington D.C. Um, and say that that's right or wrong. I'm going to let the people who are actually on the ground living next to this person as a neighbor decide whether that's excessive or not. Because I think that there are legitimate situations where it makes sense for people to be very well armed and very heavily armed. especially if, let's say, you are in the cargo industry and you might be going through an area that has pirates. So it makes a lot of sense to be heavily armed in that situation. Now, that being said, you're just driving down to the grocery store with a main battle tank is probably excessive. Now, of course, I don't know what neighborhood you live in. It might be fine. Maybe somewhere in Detroit. Uh, but um, but again, it depends on the situation, and I'm not going to pretend I know every situation, and therefore I'm going to defer to people who are actually in the situation.
Right, and I think that kind of goes on to your next point about law enforcement, because law enforcement is obviously a huge topic right now, and many people wanting to defund the police, many people wanting to give more money to police, many people not wanting to have police, all the topics going around now, and uh, I think it seems to me that you're taking a stance of law enforcement that's backed up by the law, which just sounds weird to say, but what I mean by that is like you're taking law enforcement that takes law seriously and not just trying to be law enforcement.
We see is law enforcement isn't just the police. Okay, it's also the the state attorneys, the attorney general, the various prosecutors, and crime scene investigation, and various agencies. For example, you mentioned ICE in your document. So it's more than just the cops, and therefore, I think taking a perspective that says that everybody is accountable for what the law says, first of all, is important. And therefore, we can then decide how to adjust the law in order to fix problems as they emerge. So, for example, if there's a problem of policemen, let's say, not testifying against other policemen when uh, there is abuse that has occurred of police power, that is something that some people complain about. Then we can make legislation that allows for investigations or perhaps even mandates deeper investigations into such situations. Now, of course, if that situation doesn't happen frequently, then maybe that's not something that's worth making a law over. But again, it depends on what we need and what's happening. So, in that sense, if there are policemen that are not behaving in a way that the law requires them to behave, policemen that are exceeding their authority and are treating citizens in a way that violates their rights, then those policemen themselves should be subject to law enforcement as well, because they have violated their duty, they have violated their oaths, they have violated the, you could say, sanctity of their profession, and therefore they deserve severe punishment, not only for their violation of the law, but the fact that they, as officers of the law, violated the law, which I think is something that is a huge problem. You don't want corruption emerging in the people that are supposed to be the people getting rid of corruption. So, therefore, they need to be held to a very high standard.
Mm-hmm. That's a big thing I hear
And
from police
of
reform. Yeah.
course, yeah, yeah. Now, some people talk about militarization of the police. I say it depends on where you are. If there's gangs running around with machine guns, then maybe it makes sense for the police to roll out with machine guns. and heavily armed vehicles and armored vehicles and everything. I think that makes a lot of sense if that's the threat that they face. If they're not facing anything like that, then that's possibly excessive spending. Uh, so it all depends on the situation. So I'm not against the police using military style tactics or equipment per se. I think that there are possibly quite a few situations where that's a legitimate type of action, especially in a situation where there might be insurrectionists or some other group. So, in that sense, it makes perfect sense to me. Now, if we are in a situation where there is no big danger, then that's probably excessive, and they need to reform their budgets so that they don't have to pay for excessive equipment that they're not going to use.
Hmm. You're just hitting a lot of what I've heard from police reform, and it makes a lot of sense to me. There's a YouTuber I know called Larry Lawton. I think I mentioned him before, but his whole big thing is that he was a former inmate. His whole big thing is like, no, the police doesn't need to be defunded. We actually need to manage police money better. They don't need to. Every county doesn't need to have a big bus, or every county doesn't need to have these vehicles. You can share between counties because some counties are very small. So his whole thing is about changing how the police money is spent, but he's also a big proponent on holding the police more accountable because a lot of times with police they do their own investigations, and many people find that as a very big problem because how can you do an investigation on yourself essentially? And sometimes police do good, but a lot of times a lot of people think they just throw it under the rug, and you need to be able to change people's perception of that to make sure that your community thinks that the police are being held accountable and do respect your rights. So you were hitting kind of a lot of those
Yeah,
points that I've heard
because
from him.
yeah, if the police is held accountable, the people will respect the police a lot more. I think that's something that is very important. If the police is not being held accountable, people will think the police is corrupt and that they're just trying to oppress people and do various things that are very untoward. And therefore, ensuring that corruption is weeded out and has effective mechanisms of weeding out corruption is central to preserving both high quality police and a good public image for the police.
Definitely. And yeah, definitely. I think that's the only way you're necessarily going to change it, because only then the question becomes: do are police needed? And ultimately, I think we would both answer that as yes. I think we both think that police are needed. And then when you do answer that question as yes, you then have to answer, well, how do we make the police better? Because I don't think anyone now thinks that the police as an organization or as a form of government, whatever you want to call it, is doing a excellent job. There's definitely some weaknesses of it, but I still think that it is a necessary thing to have. So now the last thing about well, yeah, the last thing about protecting the elections is a heated topic, and a lot of people have talked about that, especially with the most recent election. But how do I say this? How would you ensure that it is safe, or it is a good investigation?
Yeah, so the exact mechanisms of how we would do this.
Mm-hmm.
This is, of course, requires a number of different things. I think a big problem that we had is that while there are sometimes some very legitimate allegations that are made, there's also a lot of spurious allegations that are made. And unfortunately, sometimes the courts tend to get annoyed by the spurious allegations and therefore also disregard legitimate allegations. So, in that sense, that is a problem. So, I think uh, what could be done is instead of automatically rejecting various allegations, we need to, or demanding that only particular persons have legal standing. I think the idea of legal standing and the way it operates is sometimes excessive, where the demand was that the particular injured party would have to have uh, the correct legal standing, as but it's a public issue in an election, so theoretically anybody should have legal standing. I would say. So I think in the case of an election, anybody making an allegation should have legal standing. Also, people that are making spurious allegations, I don't think that those should be necessarily immediately rejected. However, I think that there should be a big penalty for making spurious allegations. So you should have to pay a big fine for wasting the court's time if you're making an allegation where you might not have any evidence at all. Uh, so in that case, that's something that should happen so that all cases can be heard and that therefore all evidence can be examined. So it would require some judicial reform in order to make that work.
Right, and you would still support the general way that it was done this last time. In other words, it would still go through the state courts and maybe the Supreme Court and blah blah blah. You would still support that legal process of doing so, or would you support more of, let's say, a committee of investigating it?
In the case of a federal election, because this is actually an interesting issue, because the federal election is a federal election, but also is managed by the states. And therefore, it theoretically falls into the jurisdiction of both the federal government and the states, depending on what exactly happened. So, for example, if a state sues another state, that's obviously original jurisdiction of the Supreme Court. But if someone is suing a particular committee within a state, then that's the jurisdiction of that state. And therefore, it follows through that side of things as it goes through. So I do agree, therefore, with the way the Constitution divides up which jurisdiction is which. And however, if something happens in multiple different states, I think it's fair to consolidate it into a federal case. If similar things happen in multiple different states and the same defendant is being held responsible. Now, I'm not saying that that's exactly what had happened in the recent election. I don't think that that's exactly what had happened. So that's not a place where consolidation might take place. But if Congress wished to make an investigation into the issue, I think they should also be able to investigate the issue. What I'm saying is anybody should be allowed to investigate the issue. Any court that has jurisdiction over a case should be able to make a decision on the case, and appeals should follow through as they do, as is written in the law. So I'm saying that we already have laws about all these things. The only thing I would really change is the idea of legal standing when it concerns a federal election, and also that because it is something that is essential for the functions of government, and therefore any allegation in regards to this is necessarily a severe allegation, that it should necessarily be required to you should be required uh, that that the case should be heard. Similarly to how in the United States there are laws of misprision of felony, wherein if you see a felony occur, you're legally obligated to report the felony to an officer of the law. That's actually a requirement in the U.S. government. Uh, Too bad for a lot of people, the law says you actually have to snitch. Interestingly enough, especially in regards to treason, where there's a misprision of treason law, where you're required to report treason as well if you see something that is believed to be treason. So, if you have particular evidence, then I think the court should be required to examine the evidence as a case.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that definitely.
So I would say.
No, I was just gonna say that definitely
I would say
fits.
that.
But no,
Yeah.
go on. Sorry, go on.
That. Yeah. That you get the grand jury, and you don't skip the grand jury. So whenever something like that happens, there has to be a grand jury convened in order to examine whether there is significant evidence that could lead someone to believe that there might be a problem there. And that therefore, so I think the specific legal requirement I would make is that courts should not be allowed to dismiss cases in regards to election controversies without convening a grand jury to decide whether the case should be heard.
Mm-hmm. And another quick thing to note here is that elections are run by their own state, so it's not like you can just come in and say that it is this way, because it's a little bit more complicated than that. Excuse me. I just wanted to throw that out there just in case if anybody is confused on that, because I do think that holds a lot of importance to why there has to be a kind of a internal investigation first before the federal government can just say, "Hey, we're coming in." So that I think that also needs to be
Of course, I'm not saying that my particular approach is the only legitimate approach. That's why it's not actually fully described in the platform. I'm willing to listen to other positions on this. I'm willing to listen to various solutions proposed by various congressmen to this problem. And because government in the United States is a cooperative process.
right, for sure. I was just curious to know kind of your extended beliefs, but yeah, that is definitely important. I thought we would go. I don't really have something like this in mind, but I thought we could go back to maybe the first topic because it did hint on a few of the things mentioned. But it does make me want to go back and maybe add something similar to it or add more topics. We'll see. I'll think about that. But the first kind of topic I had was justice reform. And I state here the United States, for a first world country, has the worst system when looking at several statistics. These are the steps to improve the system. The first step is get rid of private prisons. We will no longer need for-profit private prisons when restructuring the justice system. The conditions of many private prisons are worse than federal prisons. This will be done in phases with the goal to finish within 2 years. So that was when you would be talking with fellow congressmen, maybe even senators for bills that you want to make, and blah, 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 to get it done within those 2 years. And I obviously don't know exactly how it will be done, but once again, that kind of goes back to it being a platform. But stop me if you want to ask a question on one of these. The second one I have
Yeah, yeah.
is mass review of nonviolent drug offenders. Many will be released after serving a third of their time, plus no other records while in jail or prison, meeting all of the standards made by a justice committee. So here I mentioned a justice committee because I think that would be the only way you would be able to set standards that would be inflicted, and this would probably have to be done through federal prison system just because of the way it works. And there's federal, county, and private, just to throw that out there. So, and states and some. Anyway, I think that could only really be done for federal prisons, but that is a potential idea. Third point is fix recidivism rate. The U.S. has around 2 out of 3 people going back to jail or prison after already serving their first sentence. To fix this is a focus over prison rehabilitation along with the community will be needed to ensure success. And this kind of goes back to a past Getting the Answers episode we had where we talked about the justice system. And basically I take that approach that I do think we need to spend a little bit more time with rehabilitation in the prison system, but it needs to be more of a community-based solution for it to actually work instead of just trying to, make the prisoners get their GOD or whatever it might be.
I'm not entirely sure on the exact statistics, but I have heard that a lot of non-violent drug offenders actually don't have very long sentences. The reason why there's a lot is, for one, because there's a lot of offenses, but also because of recidivism, as you had mentioned. So I think a reduction in the length of sentences isn't the length of sentences here isn't the particular problem, at least based on what I've heard. I might not be exactly right. I would have to see exactly what is happening because there might be aggravating offenses and various other things involved as well. Uh,
Right.
but yeah.
I don't remember offhand the average sentence of nonviolent drug offenders with the first sentence because that's, I think, mostly what you're talking about. Sometimes with the second sentence, it gets a little bit more because the judge is trying to make a statement and whatnot. And there are cases of people getting caught with a lot of drugs and going to prisons for a long time. I think the idea what I was trying to address here, and I don't know if I said it as well as I probably could have. I might have to add a few points to kind of expand it a little bit more. But eventually I think the idea would be, and I speculate saying this because I don't know exactly if this would work, but my idea here is essentially not necessarily getting rid of sentences of drug holders, nonviolent people who got caught with drugs, because I don't necessarily think that that would be a good idea. That being said, I think that reducing sentences could be a way to prevent less people from being in jail. But then you bring it back to the question, and this is where it gets a little bit tricky, of the recidivism rate. Because if you make the sentence shorter, you might encourage more drug usage potentially. And if you're still having your police officers focus on it, then you're going to catch more people with drugs, and then you get in that constant cycle. So as of right now, I'm not particularly sure how you would stop that cycle. But one of the biggest issues going on in prisons now is simply the amount of people who are prisoners. And a lot of people think that that number needs to change in order for the recidivism rate to be fixed and many other solutions to be fixed from it. So that's kind of the approach I was taking. But I do think that there needs to be several more points explaining it and more thought on how it would potentially be done, because I would have to be relying a lot on experts of this area to fulfill how things could be finished here. Because personally, I'm not a big fan of drugs. And the libertarian take, if so to speak, is like, everybody is free to choose. It's your choice. and drugs is kind of part of it. And if you want to do drugs, then you can do drugs. Blah 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 blah. I understand that, and
Yep.
ultimately I understand the philosophy behind that. But at the same time, I definitely have a lot of moral issues with that because I don't think that it leads to more good. I don't think it leads to more good than it does lead to more bad, if that makes any sense. So that's kind of
Yeah.
what I had for my outline here for the justice reform topic, but I definitely think it needs to be at least more points are at the very least more explained on how that would happen.
Yeah, I would say my thoughts on drugs are, of course, similar to my thoughts on a lot of other things. I think it should be a community based issue. I personally wouldn't be in favor of various types of drugs in my community. Um, so in that case, I would resolve the problem that way, and then every other community is everybody else's problem. But when it concerns, however, the law as it stands, I think the law as it stands needs to be enforced vigorously. And I see a problem of a new emerging nullification crisis, even to take a term from U.S. history, uh, in that there are states that are allowing the uh, possession of marijuana despite it being disallowed. Uh, well, not necessarily the possession, but the trade of marijuana, despite it being disallowed on the federal level. Now, that being said, While I don't think that those issues should be decided on the federal level, I'm going to proceed based on what the law is rather than what I would like it to be. So, in that case, I think that federal agents should be more enforcing these things because otherwise it is a huge hit to the legitimacy of the federal government. And maintaining the legitimacy of a government is very important when running a country.
Mm-hmm. And the only counterclaim I ultimately have to that in relating to drugs and prisons, and I think you're talking more in general. I'll go ahead and say my point, then I can get into the specifics. But a lot of prisons, jails, whatever you want to call it, there's a lot of drugs that are within prisons and jails, and some inmates have said that there's actually they can find more drugs in their federal prison or jail than they could out in the streets. So there's a big drug problem happening in prisons, and that'll probably be another point I need to add because I do think that if you do want to change the perception you have on drugs and in particular sentencing, because that's kind of what I had as a point, I do think that you would have to stop the usage of drugs in prison in order for it to actually have an impact. Now, when you're talking about making harsh sentencing, it's still I think that that's also an approach you could have, and it comes to the perception. But the only counterclaim I have to it and why I brought it up is if it's a harsh sentence, but criminals know that if they end up getting caught, they're still going to be able to have drugs in prison, then I don't really know if a harsh sentence really helps people. But you could definitely argue against making a lesser sentence that it could encourage more people that maybe aren't full-on criminals to say, oh, I'll, have marijuana just because they think that if they end up getting caught, they only have to serve, let's just say, a random number, 6 months or a year or whatever it could
Yeah.
be, instead of 3 years or
Yeah.
whatever.
Another approach to reducing prison population is to go a more old fashioned way and perhaps utilize the death penalty more frequently. Although nowadays that's a less popular position.
The death penalty is kind of a funny thing, and I don't know if I brought this up in our justice episode, but the amount of prisoners that are on death row, you would be surprised to know, is California. Now they don't execute their prisoners because, frankly, it costs too much money to go through the court system to actually kill the prisoners compared to many other states like Texas and Virginia. I believe Virginia is the other one. I think Virginia, if I am right, is no longer going to execute prisoners, but Texas is still, yeah, Texas is going to be probably the top for executing their prisoners now. But I think that that's kind of a interesting thing that you would think that California wouldn't have death row, but their citizens tend to vote in support of it, but nobody ends up dying from it. Now, I think that could be a way. I think that could be a way, and the only way that could be done is probably through a constitutional amendment, like your one of your points before, because I don't necessarily think that that would be able to pass the eye of public perception, if that makes sense. But it could be definitely a way to reduce population, I think. Hard to say. I would have to look at statistics on that.
Yeah. So anyway, I think that we've actually spent quite a lot of time, and we couldn't get to every single point. Maybe we should do a part two next week.
Yes, I
Um,
was just about to
I don't
suggest
know. What
that.
do you think?
Yeah, I was just about to suggest that. I think that a part two is needed for sure because I think we have a lot more definitely to discuss, and we spent a lot of time, breaking out each of the points, which I don't know if we necessarily intended to do at the start, but I think that it's still good letting people kind of see how we think about forming our bullet points. So I'm definitely for part two.
Yeah. So I guess we can leave it at that. Tune in
Yes,
next week for part two. This
yes,
time
exactly.
on my channel on Wiltus.
Yes, I'm getting the answers on Anavultus channel. And just a quick thing, if anyone wants to suggest any more topics, you could definitely let us know in the comment section or in my Discord or any other place you can reach us on Twitter, whatever it might be. And we'll definitely be willing to potentially do one of your topics if we both find the topic interesting. We have done it before. And I'll just leave a quick opportunity to shout out any stuff that you may have going on, and then we will be getting out of here.
Yeah. Well, of course, thank you for watching, our beautiful audience. And if you'd like, you can read my book, Actionable Justice, available on Amazon Kindle or on Taurus Necris. You can purchase it, and it will be delivered to you in physical form.
Yes. Alrighty. Thank you for all tuning in, and catch you